this is chapter 4 of sociology optional. तो देखो इसमें अब ये सब छोड़ो, let's start. So foundation of every discipline is laid by some torch bearers, ठीक है, and some torch bearers, okay, and Comte, Durkheim, Marx and Weber were such torch bearers in case of sociology due to its very nature. Sociology has happily accommodated diverse thoughts in its study. On one hand, there are positivists like Durkheim, who gave society primacy. There are postmodernists, on the other side, who put individual subjectivity at the heart of the discipline. And as the discipline grew, it witnessed various phases dominated by a set of particular ideas in a particular epoch. Unlike many other scientific disciplines, truth in sociology has many shades of grey, and this has brought fresh perspectives in the discipline from time to time. Social thinkers present multiple truths, and this helps us in understanding the complex human society, which cannot be explained by one-size-fits-all type of universal rules. Their vibrant contribution has led to profound intellectual churnings in the discipline, and as a result, the discipline has evolved as a mature discipline. So we were doing thinkers, right? As there was some discussion in the earlier chapters also, social reality of life is complex and at the same time has some nuanced patterns in it. These complexities and patterns are viewed differently by different social researchers. Some have tried to view the social reality from the lenses of theoretical frameworks, while the others have contended themselves with more observation of social phenomena. We start this chapter by analyzing the earliest such endeavors, which are clubbed under the broad heading functionalism. So let's study what is functionalism. Functionalism as a perspective evolved with the beginning of sociology as a discipline, and Auguste Comte, Durkheim and Spencer put forth ideas which formed its basis. तो तुम पहले तो इनके नाम याद करो कि ऑगस्ट कॉम्टे है, डर्कहाइम है और स्पेंसर है. These three people belong to functionalist branch of sociology, and its basic premise is that society works as a system of interconnected parts, and each part exists because it has to perform certain functional prerequisites for the whole system. And this view is primarily shaped by the beliefs of functionalists that society behave like an organisms with various parts, and each part is studied in the light of the function it performs for the organism as a whole. Integration in society is the basic concern of functionalists. Now, ये देखो क्या है, tautologies and teleologies. So these are the two fundamental limiting aspects of functionalists' explanation. So we can consider them as the anti-functionalism. So tautology denotes saying the same thing twice. For example, this rectangle has four sides is tautological. Functionalists are accused of using tautological explanations. For example, functionalists claim that religion exists because it performs the function of enhancing social cohesion. But when we ask what they mean by religion, they define it as a collective activity which has the function of enhancing social cohesion. So causal relationship between two separate things, religion and social cohesion, is simply the elaboration of the definition, right? Teleology is the study of purposes, intentions or goals. Functionalists' explanations are accused of suffering from illegitimate teleologies. For example, functional explanation of social stratification is teleological in the sense that it uses serving a societal need of ensuring that the best people get the most important jobs. The problem with this is that it uses a consequence as a cause. So I'd like to know more on that, right? Alright, so देखो tautologies पहले जान लो ये क्या होता है. So functionalism in sociology views society as a system of interconnected parts that work together to maintain the stability and order of the entire system. However, tautologies and teleologies are seen as problematic in this theory. Here's how they go against the functionalism. So tautologies क्या होती हैं? Tautologies को तुम एक नज़रिए से देखो, that is circular reasoning. Functionalism often employs circular reasoning, which is a form of tautology. For instance, it asserts that institutions exist because they fulfill societal needs, and the proof of their necessity is their existence. This circular logic fails to explain the mechanism by which needs are identified, institutionalized and sustained. ठीक है, मतलब किसी चीज़ का exist करना such as a social institution, उसका क्यों एग्जिस्ट करती है उसका रीज़न ये देना, बिकॉज देर आर सर्टन सोसाइटल नीड्स एंड दैट्स वाई सच सोशल इंस्टीट्यूशंस एग्जिस्ट टू फुलफिल दोज नीड्स. तो ये तो कोई रीज़न नहीं हुआ ना. तो ये एक सर्कुलर टॉटोलॉजी रीजनिंग हो गई. इट असर्ट्स दैट इंस्टीट्यूशंस एग्जिस्ट बिकॉज दे फुलफिल सोसाइटल नीड्स and the proof of their necessity is their existence. Secondly, lack of empirical evidence. Functionalism emphasis on stability and equilibrium can lead to tautological statements that lack empirical support. For example, stating that education systems are necessary for society without examining how they reproduce or challenge inequalities through curriculum, access, and social stratification. I will tell that again. Stating that education systems are necessary for society without actually examining how they reproduce or challenge inequalities, right, through curriculum, access, and social stratification. तो बस बोल देना कि education systems are necessary for society without actually examining, that is not good. तो functionalism emphasis on stability and equilibrium, sort of status quo, can lead to tautological statements that lack empirical support. For example, stating that education systems are necessary for society without actually examining how they reproduce or how they actually fight away the inequalities of the society. Third drawback of functionalism in terms of tautologies is that overemphasis on stability. Functionalism tends to focus on the stability and equilibrium of the society, often neglecting the dynamic and contested processes that actually shape up the social institutions. This can result in tautological reasoning that reinforces deterministic or static interpretations. So, overemphasis on stability leads to focus on the stability and equilibrium of the society, often neglecting the dynamic processes that shape and evolve, help in the evolution of social institutions. तो ये भी हो गया. दूसरा ड्रॉबैक है इसका टेलियोलॉजीज. तो टेलियोलॉजीज फंक्शनलिज्म क्या होता है? पर्पस ड्रिवन एक्सप्लेनेशंस. Functionalism is criticized for its teleological approach, where explanations are given in terms of purposes or goals. For example, it might argue that a particular social institution exists to fulfill a specific function, without considering alternative structures that could fulfill the same function. This teleological reasoning can become problematic when it is stretched to the point where it is believed that only the given structure can fulfill the need. दूसरी चीज़ है कि teleological explanations in functionalism can fail to account for the idea that a variety of alternative structure can fulfill the same needs. For instance, functionalism might argue that the traditional nuclear family is essential for socializing children, ignoring the fact that single parent families or other family structures can also perform this function. तो केवल ये मान लेना कि functionalism might argue that traditional nuclear family is essential for socializing children, ignoring the fact that single parent families or other family structures can also perform this function. Then there is certain conservative bias. Functionalism teleological approach can lead to conservative bias, as it tends to justify the status quo by arguing that existing institutions and structures are necessary for social stability. This can result in an overemphasis on maintaining the current order, rather than considering the potential for social change and improvement. So in summary, we can say that tautologies and teleologies in functionalism can undermine its explanatory power by leading to circular reasoning, lack of empirical evidence, overemphasis on stability and status quo, and conservative bias that justifies the status quo. These issues highlight the need for more nuanced and dynamic approaches. तो ये हो गया, ठीक है. Now, often the terms positivism and functionalism are used in conjunction, but the two are not the same. Positivism is that strand of sociology which puts scientific study at the heart of the discipline. It aims to make the discipline scientific, and positivists tend to make the prediction by doing out theories in a similar fashion to natural sciences. So Auguste Comte was the first true positivist. ठीक है. Both the functionalist and conflict theorists like Durkheim and Marx respectively also fall under the classification, as they offered theories which are predictive in nature. Thus, functionalism is like a subset of positivism in this sense. And Durkheim was the first true functionalist. तो first true positivist कौन हो गया? Auguste Comte. And Durkheim was the first true functionalist. And functionalism can be considered as a subset of positivism. ठीक है. Functionalist approach begins with an observation that behavior of the society is a structured. Relationships between the members of the society are organized in terms of the rules. Social relationships are therefore patterned and recurrent. These relationships are guided by generalized values in the society which guide our behavior. This value consensus also provides for a certain degree of integration in the society. It was applied in different contexts by different thinkers. Malinowski used it to study religion. Murdoch used it to evaluate universality of the family. Davis and Moore used it to study stratification in society, and Herbert J. Gans used it to analyze functions of poverty, and Merton used it to study deviance. ये paragraph important है because लिखने के लिए. So the functionalist approach was applied in different contexts by different thinkers. So Malinowski used it to study religion. Murdoch used it to evaluate universality of family. Davis and Moore used it to study stratification in society. Herbert J. Gans used it to analyze functions of poverty. It became a dominant perspective in sociology during the 1940s and 50s as a variant of functionalism which was called a structural functionalism, led by Parsons and Merton, emerged, and this time onwards its popularity declined during the upheavals of the 1960s and 70s, when conflict perspective along with other perspectives again emerged as a more viable alternative. The fact that functionalists only look at the beneficial aspects of social relations leads to their criticism that their approach is conservative and status quoist. Functionalists are also accused of offering teleological explanations, that is, they confuse cause with effect in a circular fashion. For example, Davis and Moore's theory of stratification outlines that the positive functions of stratifications Davis and Moore's theory of stratification outlines the positive functions of stratifications. Then they use these effects to explain the origin of stratifications. तो stratification से कुछ तो positive effects होंगे ही, और तुम उनको गिना के बस ये कह दो कि इसीलिए stratification exist करना सही है, तो ये तो एक circular reasoning हो गई. So then critics like Alvin Goldner point out that while stressing on values in society, functionalists fail to see whose values are these. ठीक है, तो functionalist theories are also prone to ecological fallacies. That is, they assume that inference about individuals can be made out of aggregate data. For example, so functionalist theories are also prone to ecological fallacies, which mean that functionalists assume that inference about individuals can be made out of the aggregate data. For example, aggregate GDP growth data in case of the world, say in the year 2017, may be positive, but it doesn't mean that everyone is becoming better off. Functionalists make similar mistakes when they consider the larger functional role of institutions, but ignore the impact of those institutions on the individuals. Okay, तो ये है functionalist के बारे में थोड़ा सा, ठीक है. Okay, then let's read a little bit of conflict perspective. So like functionalists, conflict theorists also stress on structure and hence are predominantly positivist in their approach. They too suggest a grand framework to explain working of society, but instead of emphasizing on consensus, they focus on the divisions in society, right? So conflict perspective वाले जो लोग होते हैं, promoters होते हैं, they too suggest a grand framework to explain the working of society, but instead of emphasizing on consensus, they focus on the divisions of the society. They seek to explain why unequal relations exist in the society and how they are perpetuated. Marx was the first major social thinker who gave this perspective through his dialectical materialistic conception of history. He saw societies are divided into two classes, like a dominant upper class in the form of haves and a subjugated class in the form of have-nots. His ideas had a reflection of not only sociological analysis but also of a radical agenda of political reforms. तो उन्होंने जो ये theory दी थी, dialectical materialistic conception of history, that was not just a sociological analysis but also a radical agenda to bring about future political reforms. Now, Frankfurt School of Germany was another major carrier of Marxist ideas, but it also aimed at getting rid of deficiencies in Marxist perspective by introducing an element of culture into structural analysis. इन्होंने क्या चेंज कर दिया? एलिमेंट ऑफ कल्चर ले आए. फ्रैंकफर्ट स्कूल ऑफ जर्मनी. थियोडोर एडोर्नो, मैक्स हॉर्खहाइमर, हर्बर्ट मार्क्यूस and more recently Jürgen Habermas belong to this school, which is also known as critical school or neo-Marxist school. ठीक है, neo-Marxist school. तो इनके नाम देख लो, Jürgen Habermas, Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno. Now, German scholar Ralph Dahrendorf combined Marxist ideas with a Weberian perspective and he related conflict in society to difference in interests of individuals and groups. Unlike Marx, who related conflict only with class, Dahrendorf, taking cues from Weber, also added dimension of power and authority. तो ये जर्मन स्कॉलर जो थे Ralph Dahrendorf, he combined Marxist ideas with Weberian perspective. How? So he related conflict in the society to difference in interests of individuals and groups, unlike Marx, who related conflict in the society only due to class. So individual interests and differences of individuals and groups को भी फैक्टर इन किया गया था बाय Dahrendorf, जिसकी वजह से सोशल मतलब inequality थी. Now, Ivan Illich applied Marxist ideas in the field of education and culture. Then Pierre Bourdieu used the conflict perspective to develop his model of fourfold capitals in modern societies. And Wallerstein used this perspective to study the effect of globalization and unequal trade among nations. Some of these ideas are discussed in the later chapters. While the functionalist perspective declined significantly after 1960s, conflict perspective is more enduring and has continued to evoke interests of sociologists in the wake of new events like global financial crisis of 2011 and Jasmine Revolution in the Middle East of 2012. तो read a lot more about Jasmine Revolution. इसके बाद अगले लेक्चर में हम लोग देखेंगे मार्क्स के बारे में. ठीक है, तो अभी के लिए ये 4 पेजेस में हमको ये पता चला कि what is the basic difference or what all you can write about conflict perspective and functionalism and what are the drawbacks of functionalism, right? So अब देखो यहाँ पे क्या है कि understand the various theoretical perspectives in society, explain differences between functionalist and conflict perspective, and understand concepts of historical materialism, ideal types, social actions, pattern variables among others. तो अब थोड़ा सा AI से भी हम पूछते हैं कि what is a neo-Marxist, or we can ask conflict perspective. So the conflict perspective in sociology is a theoretical framework that views society as a complex system characterized by inequality and conflict among groups competing for scarce resources. It emphasizes the ways in which power and resources are distributed unevenly and how this leads to social tension and change. So key concepts यहाँ पे हैं जैसे inequality and power dynamics. So social stratification. Conflict theorists focus on how societies are divided into different stratas based on factors such as class, race, gender, and ethnicity. The conflict perspective highlights how certain groups dominate others through control of resources, institutions, and social norms. Then there's this class conflict. So the conflict perspective is if we, right, so we were saying कि conflict perspective में देखो की कॉन्सेप्ट्स एक तो इनइक्वालिटी एंड पावर डायनामिक्स है, फिर दूसरे पॉइंट में क्लास कन्फ्लिक्ट है, और तीसरे पॉइंट में सोशल चेंज है, चौथे पॉइंट में इंटरसेक्शनैलिटी है. ठीक है ना, फिर कुछ क्रिटिसिजम्स हैं. तो अब एग्जांपल्स देखते हैं पहले. तो कहाँ गया, हाँ, लेबर मूवमेंट्स. सो वर्कर्स वर्सेस एम्प्लॉयर्स. लेबर मूवमेंट्स आर क्लासिक एग्जांपल्स ऑफ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट थ्योरी इन एक्शन. वर्कर्स ऑर्गेनाइज्ड टू डिमांड बेटर वेजेस, वर्किंग कंडीशंस एंड राइट्स, often in conflict with employees who seek to maximize profits. फिर सिविल राइट्स मूवमेंट्स में भी देखने को मिलता है, फेमिनिस्ट मूवमेंट्स में भी देखने को मिलता है. क्रिटिसिज्म एंड लिमिटेशंस की बात करें तो critics argue that the conflict perspective sometimes overlooks the ways in which cooperation and consensus also play a role in society. Not all social interactions are characterized by conflict. And दूसरा criticism है कि reductionism. Some critics feel that conflict perspective reduces complex social phenomena to simple struggles over resources. मतलब interaction in social systems goes beyond than simple argument over the struggle of owning resources, ignoring other important factors. So it's much more complex and deeper problem. So it reduces the conflict perspective, reduces the other aspects of social interactions, and using conflict perspective, the interactions or social changes are reduced down to simple struggles over resources, ignoring other important factors. तो ये दो criticism है. तो अब intersectionality क्या है देखो, multiple axes of inequality. Modern conflict theorists often incorporate intersectionality Recognizing that individuals and groups can experience multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. For example, a person might face discrimination based on their race, gender, and class. Complex intersections. This perspective acknowledges that different forms of inequality intersect and compound each other, creating unique experiences of oppression and resistance. ठीक है, तो फिर अगले से हम लोग देखते हैं ये मार्क्स. Right, so now you see Marx historical materialism. What is that? And he has talked about mode of production, alienation, and class struggle. Let's see. So Karl Marx was one of the early pioneers of the discipline of sociology. He laid the foundation of conflict perspective in sociology, which was radically different from the then prevailing structural functionalist view. तो जब वो आए थे तब prevalent opinion क्या था? Structural functionalist view था. वो जब आए तो conflict perspective का स्थापना start हो गया. Although conflict theories came under severe criticism during the 19th century because of their radical nature, his contribution to sociology in terms of theories, concepts, methods, and perspectives is unmatched, as he provided an alternative narrative which has endured the test of times even today. He wrote in a background when industrialization and capitalism were in full swing in Europe, and Europe was witnessing post-French Revolution changes. Changes in Europe were too profound, and social environment was in a huge flux. It prompted Marx to give a thought about misery and suffering of the people whom he was as victims of the new economic order called capitalism. Inequality among the social classes prompted Marx to put forward a theory about the current state in capitalism and its origin in history. Now, historical materialism, or the materialistic conception of history, is the pivot to all the works of Marx. Its clearest exposition is done in his contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859. That's the name of the book. Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. It is a conception of his society in terms of evolutions from one stage to another, which Marx refers to as modes of production, and material or economic factors have a pivotal role in historical change. This is the crux of his historical materialism, ye line, that material or economic factors have a pivotal role in historical change. It is an inquiry into nature of relations between man and things as the history proceeds. His theory is called historical because analysis of society is in terms of evolution from one state to another as the time passes and history is made. According to Marx, history is a process of man's self-creation. Since man's involvement into relations of production creates history, it is necessary to understand history to understand society. It is called materialistic for two reasons. Firstly, his conception of society is based upon materialistic and not metaphysical factors which are understood in terms of material production. Secondly, understanding of change is based upon changing material condition and not ideas. I will repeat that. It is called historical because analysis of society is in terms of evolution from one state to another as the time passes and history is made. According to Marx, history is a process of man's self-creation. ठीक है? It is called historical because it is an analysis of society in terms of evolution from one state to another, and it is called materialistic because firstly, his conception of society is based upon materialistic and not metaphysical factors. Secondly, understanding of change is based upon changing material conditions of society and not the ideological conditions of society. Further, his theory of historical materialism has two aspects. His materialistic conception of society is in terms of economic infrastructure and social superstructure. These 2 points are very important. ये दो शब्द रट लो. इकोनॉमिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का कैसे तालमेल है सोशल सुपरस्ट्रक्चर का, which are two conceptual entities created by Marx to understand the modes of production or society. तो इन दोनों का इस्तेमाल करते हुए how he explains the modes of production or society. Let's see. He understands the historical evolution process in terms of dialectic process where two opposing forces interact with each other and new structures are produced and the dialectic process continues. तो ये जो शब्द है dialectic process, इसका मतलब ये होता है कि two opposing forces interact with each other and परिणाम स्वरूप new structures are produced and the dialectic process continues. So Marx borrowed ideas of historical or dialectical materialism from the Hegelian notions of dialectical idealism. But Marx felt that Hegel's idealism led to a very conservative political orientation, and Ludwig's a young Hegelian notion of materialism is more relevant. तो उन्होंने बेसिकली हेगेलियन नोशंस का इस्तेमाल किया, बट थोड़ा सा चेंज करके. ठीक है, उन्होंने हेगेलियन आइडियलिज्म को थोड़ा सा कंजर्वेटिव पाया, इसलिए उन्होंने लुडविग वर्जन्स ऑफ हेगेलियन इंटरप्रिटेशन को प्रमोट किया और ज़्यादा रेलेवेंट पाया, और वो था यंग हेगेलियन नोशन. राइट, सो ही वाज इन फेवर ऑफ यंग हेगेलियन नोशन ऑफ मटेरियलिज्म. Thus, he retained the dialectical approach of Hegel, but replaced the idealism with Feuerbach's materialism, which was a sort of young Hegelian notion. So Marx believed that material sources and conditions, and not ideas per se, are important in the working of any mode of production. I repeat, Marx believed that material sources and not ideas are important in the working of any mode of production. Material world is characterized by its own independent existence and is not a result of human thinking. Material world is characterized by its own independent existence, and that is not a result of human thinking. Marx was also influenced by political economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, who had postulated that labor was the source of all wealth. Marx was also influenced by the political economists' depiction of the horrors of the capitalist system and the exploitation of the workers, but he did not deem such evils as inevitable, as he saw their solution in communism. So ये line important है. Marx was also influenced by the political economists' depiction of horrors of the capitalist system and the exploitation of the workers, but he did not deem such evils as inevitable. So he kind of, such evils according to him were obvious, but he did have a solution to such evils, and that lied in the communism. So he was influenced by political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, जो labor को source of all wealth मानते हैं. Also, he was also influenced by political economists जो कि capitalism के अंदर छुपा हुआ जो exploitation of labor है उसको भी वो मानते हैं. साथ ही में उनके पास एक solution भी है उस exploitation का, that lies in communism. In order to survive, man must produce. ये line Marx की है. Production is essential for the survival of human beings. It is the first historical act and had been universally a part of human history throughout. While going for production, man enters into relationships with other men. It is the fundamental aspect of history. Man produces to satisfy his needs, which are ever growing, and according to Marx, man is a perpetually dissatisfied animal. तो यहाँ से दो चीज़ें आपको याद रखनी है. That in order to survive, man must produce, and the second thing is that man is a perpetually dissatisfied animal. Once a set of needs is satisfied, new ones are created. Thus production continues and history proceeds. In order to produce, man must enter into relations with others. Apart from relations, some forces of production are also required, which include tools, techniques, skills, etc. So man must enter into relations with others in order to produce, alongside some possession of tools and equipments, skills, etc. अब ये क्या लिखा है? What do you mean by praxis? It literally means practical as against mere theory. David Harvey defines it as practical reflective activity. Critical theorists often argue for the use of praxis against theory in search of practical solutions to social problems. So ये भी Marx लेके आए थे. Its praxis suggests action as a pointer to philosophical speculation. It thus forms the basis of dialectic materialism. So I think praxis forms the basis of dialectic materialism. How? Secondly, it implies that the fundamental characteristic of human society is material production against idealism. To meet the basic needs, man primarily acts on the natural world, that is, he works and only secondarily thinks about it. In terms of Marx's idea of social change, it also implies that it is not enough to understand the world, we must also try to improve it by real actions. So praxis के बारे में और देख लेते हैं. What is praxis according to Marx? Okay, so praxis in general means it's the process by which a theory or a skill is enacted, embodied, realized, applied, or put into practice. It refers to the act of engaging, applying, exercising, realizing, or practicing ideas. This concept has been a recurrent topic in philosophy discussed by thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle. So, praxis, according to Marx, praxis is a central concept that refers to the free, universal, creative, and self-creative activity through which humans create and change their historical world and themselves. This activity is unique to humans and distinguishes them from other beings. Marx's concept of praxis appears in two of his early works, economic and philosophical manuscripts. ठीक है, तो आई थिंक ये समझ में आ गया कि केवल सोचना नहीं चाहिए बल्कि पुटिंग आइडियाज़ इन मोशन, ये मतलब इसका ये जा रहा है. ठीक है, नाउ मूविंग ऑन. सो अकॉर्डिंग टू मार्क्स देयर आर टू टाइप्स इन एनी मोड ऑफ प्रोडक्शन. दो प्रकार के मोड्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन है. रिलेशंस बिटवीन मैन एंड मैन. So they pertain to the associations which individuals form in order to undertake production, and these associations also lead to stratification and formulation of classes depending upon different position in the production process. तो ये तो हमको पता है. ठीक है. Second is relations between man and things. They are the nature of ownership and non-ownership of things required in the production. The haves control the production process in every mode of production, whereas the have-nots are non-owners in the production process and just own their labor. ठीक है. Man is free to sell his labor in an industrial society. Similarly, in other societies or mode of productions, ownership and non-ownership relations exist. So according to Marx, these relations are dynamic. Antagonism keeps increasing, resulting into conflict between the two classes. Similarly, the relationship between man and things also keeps changing. In a capitalist society, Marx foresees such a degree of exploitation that man loses control over his own labor also. According to Marx, these social relationships determine the existence of man and not his own will. According to Marx, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being determines their consciousness. That is, men themselves don't decide what type of social relations they will have. Rather, social relations determine who they will be ruled, or the ruler. That is, material conditions also shape the mental conditions of human being. Men are not driven by their inner voices, as these voices are subdued by material considerations and the social relations created by these dominant material relations. बहुत ही subtle बात यहाँ लिखी हुई है. According to Marx, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being determines their consciousness, right? In fact, यहाँ being की जगह positioning होना चाहिए. It is not the consciousness, internal consciousness of the men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social positioning determines their consciousness. मार्क्स का ये मतलब था. So फिर से बता रहे हैं. देखो, दो प्रकार के रिलेशंस बताए. एक तो ऐसा रिलेशन जो कि आदमी के साथ बनाता है और उस प्रकार से फिर एक हायरार्की क्रिएट होती है प्रोडक्शन प्रोसेस में, हैव और हैव नॉट्स की. दूसरा रिलेशन ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ मैन एंड थिंग्स. लाइक अब जो ओनर होगा उसका रिलेशन किसके साथ होगा? अपनी इक्विपमेंट्स, अपनी कैपिटल, अपने लैंड, अपने जो भी प्रॉपर्टीज़ वगैरह होगी. सो दे आर द नेचर ऑफ ओनरशिप्स. द हैव्स कंट्रोल द प्रोडक्शन प्रोसेस in every mode of production by owning the tools, equipments, raw material, etc. Whereas the have-nots are the non-owners in the production process and they just own their labor. Man is free to sell his labor in an industrialized society. Similarly, in other societies or mode of productions, ownership and non-ownership relations exist. According to Marx, these relations are dynamic और ये भी बदलते रहते हैं. Antagonism keeps increasing, resulting into conflict between the two classes. Similarly, the relationship between man and things also keeps changing. In a capitalist society, Marx foresees such a degree of exploitation that the man loses his control over his own labor. Alright, और दूसरी चीज़ ये कह रहे हैं कि it is not the internal consciousness of the men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being determines their consciousness. Men themselves do not decide what type of social relations, especially in the realm of a production process, they will have. Rather, social relations determine who they will be ruled, or the ruler. That is, material conditions also shape the mental conditions of human being. Men are not driven by their inner voices, as these voices are subdued by the material consideration and the social relations created by these dominant material relations. Then forces of production क्या कह रहा है? According to Marx, forces of production have two aspects, which are men and things. Men are further categorized into the haves and the have-nots. Things include tools, techniques, equipments, skills, etc. Major changes in the society occur when new forces of productions are evolved. which also create new relations of production which replace the older ones and create a new mode of production. A contradiction between the older and newer forces of productions is resolved by the replacement of older mode of production by the newer one. In every society, there is centrality of one major thing. For example, in feudal society, land is central. In capitalist society, capital is central. Forces of production help in transforming the things which are available in nature into things which can be exchanged in the market. Forces of production also represent man's control over nature. As the history proceeds, man's control over nature increases. Thus, man and nature are also in a state of constant struggle, and the development in the forces of production can be seen in terms of man's increasing control over nature. ये भी एक अच्छा व्यू पॉइंट है, ठीक है. Both the forces and relations of production change continuously, and together the two constitute economic base or economic infrastructure of society. This constant interplay results into a particular type of social formation or social state, which is called the mode of production, or roughly referred as society or social formation according to Marx. तो हमने यहाँ क्या क्या देखा, देखो, एक होता है फोर्सेस ऑफ प्रोडक्शन. अभी हमने देखा था दैट वाज ये था रिलेशंस ऑफ प्रोडक्शन. तो रिलेशंस ऑफ प्रोडक्शन में दो प्रकार के रिलेशंस बताए गए, एक मैन के साथ और एक मैन का थिंग्स के साथ, ठीक है. और ये भी डायनामिक होता है, ठीक है. उसके बाद हमने बताया कैसे इंटरनल कॉन्शियसनेस ऑफ मैन इज़ नॉट द वाइटल फैक्टर जो डिटरमिन करता है कि उसके बीइंग को डिटरमिन नहीं करता है. रादर हिज सोशल पोजिशनिंग एक्चुअली डिटरमिन्स हिज कॉन्शियसनेस, ठीक है. तो दैट वाज रिलेशंस ऑफ प्रोडक्शन हमने देखा था यहाँ पे, ये रिलेशंस ऑफ प्रोडक्शन. अब हम दूसरे ये देख रहे हैं फोर्सेस ऑफ प्रोडक्शन. तो फोर्सेस ऑफ प्रोडक्शन में तुम ये याद रखो, ये वाली लाइन, इन एवरी सोसाइटी देयर इज सेंट्रलिटी ऑफ वन मेजर थिंग. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, इन फ्यूडल सोसाइटी लैंड इज सेंट्रल, कैपिटलिस्ट सोसाइटी में कैपिटल इज सेंट्रल. So these are like central forces of production. So these help in transforming the things which are available in nature into things which can be exchanged in the market. And forces of production also represents man's control over nature. As the history proceeds, man's control over nature increases. Thus, man and nature are also in a state of constant struggle, and the development in the forces of production can be seen in terms of man's increasing control over nature. तो forces of production को ये मान सकते हो. So forces of production can include men and the things, ठीक है. Forces of production में क्या क्या आ जाएगा, men and things, ठीक है, men and things. अब ये यहाँ पे जो things हैं ये देखो कैसे बदलती रह रही है हिस्टोरिकली. कभी land become the central thing, कभी labor become the central thing, right? कभी capital becomes the central thing. तो man and things are two pillars of forces of production. तो ये बताने की कोशिश है. So both the forces and relations of production change continuously, and together the two constitute economic infrastructure of any society. अब इसके बाद देखो इकोनॉमिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर क्या होता है, सोशल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर, सोशल सुपर स्ट्रक्चर क्या होता है, ये हम देखेंगे अगले में.